Hey, church family, thank you for joining us for our Wednesday evening Bible study. We're going to continue our study on the visions of Daniel. We'll do that in just a moment. Before we get into that, I wanted to remind you about people to put on our prayer list and to keep in your prayers. Two of those are Michelle Brooks' grandchildren, Basha and Solomon. Both of them are struggling with RSV, so we need to keep them in our prayers. As well as Lachlan Beatty, Scott and Carmel Beatty's little boy. He's going to have a procedure at Children's on Monday. And then Carmel Beatty's sister, Candace, is also having a procedure on Monday. So they have a lot going on with their family right now. In addition to that, we need to remember Dennis and Peggy Vonderfeck's daughter, Kristen, who had hip surgery recently, and Jim and Jeannie Lovell's niece, Sherry. She is in very serious condition in the hospital. And so we need to keep all of those folks, as well as the others that we continue to have on our prayer list, in the forefront of our minds as we approach the throne of grace. I also want to remember Virginia Bailey's mother, Sybil, and Virginia. Her mother is not doing very well at all. And of course, Sophie Ellis came and so preciously asked for us to pray for her on Sunday, and so we definitely want to be praying for Sophie Ellis. We never want to forget to give thanks to God, and we have lots of things to be thankful to God for, but especially when we see new life come into this world in a safe way. And so we are thankful to give thanks to God for the arrival of Curtis and Jeanette Bledsoe's great-grandson, John David, and then, of course, Dylan and Rachel Oakley's little boy, Hayes Michael. Cannot wait to meet him. Of course, Curtis and Susan Taylor are the grandparents from here at West End, and we're so excited that Hayes Michael has arrived in the world safely, and everyone is doing well. By way of events coming up, we have lots of things happening in October. We're kind of reopening a lot of stuff, and I'll talk more about that in just a moment. But this coming Sunday, October the 4th, we have a shower for Bethany Priotti. She is registered at Amazon and also at Target, and that's going to be a drive-by bridal shower. Those have become very popular lately, and our ladies do a great job putting those on. So this drive-by bridal shower for Bethany Priotti is going to be at the front of the church building. That's going to be between 1 and 2 p.m. Also on October the 4th, our Kids for Christ are going to get together and go sing to some of our extra special people. And then when they've done that, they're going to come back and they're going to watch a movie together. So that should be lots of fun and very uplifting for a lot of people who are in need of seeing those young people's faces and hearing their voices. By way of mentioning young people, on October 31st, we are going to have Trunk or Treat. Yes, we're going to do it. We're going to have it. It's an outside event, so we feel like we're going to be able to pull that off pretty easily. And you'll hear more details about that as we get closer to time. I'm so excited that we're going to do that October the 31st. This past Sunday was the beginning of our $1 Million Sunday campaign for Eastern European missions. Of course, what they're raising money for, as they do every year here, is to put Bibles in the hands of children in Eastern Europe. So if you missed last Sunday, that's fine. You can always give for the next couple of weeks. Just put that in the memo field, EEM, or you can actually give anytime through the online giving portal, and that is at wecoc.org/giving. There's a special designation just for EEM if you'd like to give that way. Also remember, we are finishing up the collection for the We Care College packages. So thankful for the Wootons taking this on and making sure that our children who are away at college are receiving some package from home that reminds them that we still care about them, all right? So if you haven't done that, you need to do that soon and get that to the church office by October 2nd, by 11 a.m. October 2nd, because I think that's when they're actually going to put those care packages together. Of course, a list of suggested items is in the handout that you should have received by email. So October the 11th, the elders have told us that we're going to start meeting for 9 a.m. Bible class, 10 a.m. worship, 6 p.m. worship, and then 7 p.m. Wednesday Bible study. How we're going to do that? Well, all of that is now on the website as far as the guidelines for all of that. So you can go and check that out if you'd like to at wecoc.org. They're right there on the front page. In addition to that, for those of you who are members who have children that are infant through 5th grade, you will need to contact the church building. So we need you to either call the church office or email the church office using the info at wecoc.org to let us know that your child is going to attend class on Sunday, October the 11th, or Wednesday, October the 14th, or both of those. We need that information so that our education coordinators can put together the individualized packets that each child is going to receive, and so they can just prepare to make sure they have a room that is large enough for the children to be spaced out while they're in there. We're trying to take those safety protocols very serious so that your children's health is not something that you're questioning while they're here. But we need you to make sure that you're doing that. You need to call or email the church office and let us know very soon whether your children are going to be coming, if your child is going to be coming to Bible class. Along with that, we are implementing an even more aggressive disinfectant program. We're so very thankful to Dean Shipley as he has coordinated that all throughout this pandemic for us, and he's done a great job of that. We have a great cleaning crew that comes in. Fred, our janitor, does a good job, and then we have a disinfectant crew that comes in after him and disinfects the building, and that's going to ramp up because we're going to be using the building more. So here's what that means for you. If you would be interested in helping with that in regards to helping this disinfectant person get to the right parts of the building and make sure that they're completing their task, we need you to contact Dean Shipley so that you'll be able to get with him and he can show you what needs to be done. Now, you won't be doing the disinfecting. That's the company's job, but you will need to meet them here and help make sure that each of the areas that needs to be disinfected is taken care of. So that will be your job. That will be like your volunteer ministry to make sure that we have a facility that is safe and secure, not only for us during worship and Bible class, but also for the West End Kindergarten as well. We need to remember that they meet in our building, and we need to help take care of those folks as well. So if you're interested in that, make sure that you either contact the church office or contact Dean Shipley directly. And that would be of a great help to us right now because we're doing that Sundays, twice on Sundays and on Wednesdays. And so we have a lot of disinfectant that needs to go on. We need a lot of folks to volunteer to help us do that so that no one person has to be burdened with all of that. So if you'd be interested in helping with that, please let Dean Shipley know or just contact the church office and we'll let Dean know as well. That's what I have for you tonight. I know that was quite a few announcements, quite a few prayer requests, but I think it's important for us to stay in connection with one another and in contact and informed. And that's what the purpose of this is tonight. So tonight we are going to begin our study of chapter 8. We're only going to look at the first half of chapter 8. This is a little bit easier chapter for us to understand, but there's still a lot of challenges that we find in it. But I think by being challenged and studying these lessons, we can only grow, right? And be reminded of just how awesome our God is and exactly what He's done for us. So, without any further ado, let's engage in our Bible study of Daniel chapter 8 now. Everyone, thank you for joining us for our continued study on the visions of Daniel. Tonight, we're going to begin our study of chapter 8. The first part we're going to look at is just kind of reading through the first section, the vision that Daniel has. Next week, what we'll do is we'll take a look at the interpretation that's offered. And there are a couple of reasons that we're going to do it this way. One is that as we just kind of glance over the vision itself, we'll make a few general observations about who the goat is, who the ram is. But next week, we're going to really get into kind of the historical part that we see here in chapter 8. We just don't have time to do it all in one study, so that's kind of the way I wanted to divide it up. A little bit of background as we get started here that we see in verse 1 actually. It says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at the first." So this vision is 2 years after the vision that Daniel's had in chapter 7. This vision is going to specifically hone in on the second and third kingdoms that we looked at in Daniel chapter 2 and in Daniel chapter 7. So it's like this vision kind of specifically hones in on just a period of time that the Jews are going to experience in the future, but he's giving us a little bit more information here. So Daniel receives this vision that has more specifics about that second and third kingdom. And of course we know that to be the Medo-Persian and the Grecian kingdoms that come to be. There are, for the most part, this chapter is actually it's a lot easier to decipher than chapter 7, but there are still some challenges in it. For instance, what are the 2,300 mornings and evenings, or evenings and mornings that we look at towards the end of our section tonight? And we'll make some observations about possibilities with that. Also, as I mentioned, the reason we're dividing this up is there is a huge amount of historical information that we find here. And that's part of what makes Daniel chapter 8 such an amazing part of Scripture, is because it's so detailed in regards to the history that we see, where we don't have an inspired record in the Word of God, but we have all kinds of historical records that show us that, look, God said all this stuff was going to happen long before it happened. And again, renews our faith in the accuracy of the Word of God. And the fact that it's not just a document of men, it is from God. So as we dive in, we've already looked at verse 1, but let's go back and look at verse 2. Because here he says, "And I saw in the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa the citadel, which is in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision, and I was in Ulai canal. And I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram." So already in the first couple of verses, we're finding the location that Daniel is mentioning. And remember, this is all happening in the vision. So he's not actually in these locations. But the Susa in the citadel is 200 miles east of Babylon. And this, if you'll remember, if you look at Esther chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, this is where Esther served as queen of Persia. Same area, okay? He is at the Ulai Canal, which, according to historical record, was a man-made irrigation canal. So we're talking about an advanced culture, right? Not just some, barbaric culture, but a very refined culture where they had things like irrigation canals. And again, remember, he is there in the vision, not necessarily there physically, located at that particular point in time. But as we get into looking at this particular vision itself, let's go and let's make some observations as we read this first section about who we're talking about here. So in verse 3, he says, "I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had 2 horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. And I saw a ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great." So as we look at this particular section here, in verses 3 and 4 specifically, we are reminded here, in fact, we find out in verse 20 specifically, we're just told in the interpretation of this, that this ram that he sees at first on the edge of the canal here is symbolic of the Medo-Persian Empire. And if you remember the bear in chapter 7 that represented the Medo-Persian Empire, the bear was raised up, like one side of the bear was raised up higher than the other. And we thought that perhaps that alluded to the fact that out of the Medo-Persian Empire, that eventually the Persian Empire was going to reign in dominance. And that's what we see here again, is we have one horn that's bigger than the other, and again, probably a symbol of the prominence that the Persian part of the empire would come to have rather than the Medes themselves. So the ram dominates in all directions, if you'll notice that. Almost all directions. And that probably symbolizes the Persian dominance of the world at that point over Western nations. Know that he's going western, going to the west side, and then he goes south. So in the Western nations, his dominance over nations like Syria, Babylon, Asia Minor goes to the north. We have northern nations that Persia ruled over, the Armenians, the Scythians. And then we go to the southern kingdoms like Egypt and Ethiopia, and we see that the Persians are reigning over those areas as well. So that's most likely what is meant as the ram is just kind of going all these different directions. It says that nobody can stand against him. Nobody can be rescued by them. And the Persians, man, they dominated, right? They were a force to be reckoned with. And that's what we're talking about here. It says he did as he pleased and became great. But then look at verse 5, because something happens to the ram. Just as we've seen in the others, there's a progression. There's a new kingdom that pops up. And as we look at verses 5 through 8, we're going to read about a goat, a he-goat, that shows up out of nowhere, it seems like. So verse 5, "As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west, across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came to the ram with the 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him with a powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his 2 horns. And the ram had no power to stand. No power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him, and there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great." You see, a new nation has arisen here. Became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, something interesting happens here. And this corresponds with history. I mean, just with history, just perfectly with history. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. And instead of it, there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. And we'll talk more about that here in just a moment. But the goat comes in the form of a male goat. And this would be representative. The goat was something, of course, the ram was something that you would see connected with the Persian Empire. The goat was something that in historical records was connected to the Grecian Empire. But from the west comes this male goat, and we find out in verse 21, this is the Grecian Empire. This is Greece. And again, corresponds with the statue we see in Daniel 2, corresponds with the beast that we see, the progression of the beast in Daniel chapter 7. And it comes and it tramples down this ram. And if you read about Alexander the Great, so the great horn that we see here is most likely Alexander the Great. And what he was able to do to the Persian Empire in a mere 3 years, he dominated. He just destroyed them. Now it says that he comes enraged. And if you look into the background, and we may have some time to talk about this next week, the way that the Persian Empire had dealt with the Greeks in the past, they had treated them horribly. Of course, the Persians had treated most everybody horribly, but they treated them pretty bad. And so this seems to be sort of the idea of vengeance being dealt out on the Persian Empire. But Greece overwhelmed the entire Persian Empire in about 3 years. And we see that in the breaking of the horns of the ram, that is horns are a symbol of power, and the breaking of those horns would be the symbol of the loss of power. So here's something in an apocryphal work called First Maccabees. And you may be familiar with this work, but these are works that we think have some historical value, but we do not consider them to be inspired works. There are some issues within the documents themselves. We can tell that they're not inspired. But in First Maccabees, this is what we read about Alexander the Great. It says, he advanced to the ends of the earth and plundered many nations. And when the earth became quiet before him, he had dominated it, he was exalted and his heart was lifted up. But something happens when the goat takes down the ram. Did you notice it? And I brought it to your attention when we were reading it. It says he became exceedingly great in verse 8. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken. Alexander the Great is actually very young. He's in his 30s when he dies. He is still, in essence, kind of trying to conquer even unknown worlds, so to speak, at this point. He's conquered the known world as far as what he knows. And he's very young when he dies, and he has no heir. There is no heir to pass off his kingdom to. And so what happens is his empire is divided among 4 of his generals. And we're going to get more specific into those details next week and not this week, because we want to cover some of the rest of what we see here. But this is a reference, like I said, to the death of Alexander the Great. And since he leaves no heir behind, things kind of go a little bit crazy. And we'll get more into that next week. But as we look at verses 9 through 14, because out of one of those conspicuous 4 horns that arises in the place of Alexander the Great, right? Those 4 generals, Daniel's vision hones in on, kind of narrows and focuses down on one of those horns. And it would have been the horn that would have dealt with the southern kingdom, like the Judean kingdom and Jerusalem themselves. And let's look at that in verses 9 through 14. It says, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great to the south, toward the east and toward the glorious land. Now we would think the glorious land there would be a reference to Judea, would be a reference to Jerusalem. So as we move on in verse 10, it grew great, even to the host of heaven, and some of the host of some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. That sounds pretty serious, doesn't it? Verse 11, it became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offerings because of the transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, for how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate? Talk more about that in a little bit. And giving over of the sanctuary host to be trampled underfoot. And he said to me, for 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. As we look and investigate this. There'll be some things we talk more specifically about tonight, and other things we reserve for our study for next week. But as we examine this together tonight, we've already made mention about the idea of honing in on one of those horns. And this would be the section, this would be the area that the person who ends up affecting those who are God's people, the Jewish people. And as we get into some more detail next week, to kind of hit the surface, there are some things that this person or this ruler is actually able to do. And listen to some of the things. He's able to throw down the host of heaven and trample them, become as great, seemingly, as the prince of the host. The regular burnt offering is taken away. The sanctuary is overthrown. The truth is thrown to the ground. And most likely, as we investigate this and we look at the progression of this historical record, we think that this is a reference to Antiochus IV, also called Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, we're really going to get into a discussion about him next week. But by way, what we know about him, historically speaking, is that he becomes a great persecutor of the people of God, a great persecutor. He brings horrible atrocities upon the Jewish people. But we also know is that persecution does not last forever. And so one of the things that we know is that there is actually a revolt that occurs. And so that leads us into this discussion about these 2,300 evenings and mornings. And that's, like I said, one of the most difficult parts of this passage. Before we get there, again, there is a revolt. We call it the Maccabean revolt. And at a time when Antiochus Epiphanes prescribed some of these great atrocities, what happens is finally some of the Jewish people have had enough and they rise up in revolt and they overthrow Antiochus Epiphanes in Jerusalem and are able to restore temple worship for a period of time. So that's kind of what is all wrapped up in this. But this 2,300 evenings and mornings, that's something that, like I said, is the most difficult part of this passage. And as we go back and read this, the idea is that these hosts, or these angels, we would think that these are angels having this conversation in front of Daniel, that the angels look at each other and are like, well, how long is this going to be allowed to go on? And one of them replies, well, 2,300 evenings and mornings. So what is being referred to here with the 2,300 evenings and mornings in light of, we believe this to be, in essence, a discussion about what will eventually happen with Antiochus Epiphanes? Well, here are some of the theories. One is that this is a discussion about a period of about 3.5 years. And in the context, since we're talking about offerings and we're talking about temple worship, that 2,300, if we're talking about 2,300 evenings and mornings, that we would say that that's a reference to around 1,150 days. Because if you remember, the regular burnt offerings were offered in the morning and in the evening. And so as we consider that in light of this, we would say, well, that makes sense. So we're talking about 1,150 days because we're talking about evening and morning sacrifices being offered. So those would happen on the same day. So we're talking about a period of a little over 1,100 days, which is about 3.5 years. There are advocates of this, as we get into this historical record more next week, advocates of this particular idea about the 2,300 evenings and mornings would say, well, from the time that the temple is desecrated until the time that it is restored is a period of about 3 years. So that sounds pretty reasonable, right? Others would say that this is a series of 2,300 individual days, which kind of roughly equates to being 6 years and 4 months. Advocates of this theory say, well, if you start when Antiochus begins to really persecute the Jews to the time of the rededication of the temple, which, by the way, is the celebration, even today, of the Jewish nation of Hanukkah. It's the Feast of Dedication, right? And that's what it's about. It's about this Maccabean revolt and the restoration of worship in the temple. So that's what Hanukkah is about, the Festival of Lights. And there's a story behind that. We may or may not have time to discuss that next week. But there are some people that say, well, this 2,300 evenings and mornings is 6 years and 4 months, and that really kind of covers that whole period of time where Antiochus persecutes the Jews, and then when they're able to rededicate the temple and begin worship again. And then there are others, and this falls into the camp. This theory falls into the camp of people who believe that Daniel has yet to be fulfilled. So when I tell you this theory, you're going to be like, well, that sounds pretty far-fetched, and it is. It is far-fetched because it doesn't necessarily match with the context, the historical context of what's being addressed here in Daniel chapter 8. But there are some who say that this 2,300 evenings and mornings is a reference to 2,300 years. And so, again, when we deal with apocryphal literature, people can get pretty crazy with what they think sometimes. So, in other words, they say this 2,300 years, and that would equate to roughly being the year 1966 or 1967. And for those of you who might be a little older, that brings to mind the Six-Day War. And if you're not familiar with the Six-Day War, you can Google that, you can see that, and it was a pretty significant period of time for the nation of Israel as it exists today, so to speak. And they say, well, that's what that is about. The problem with that is it doesn't fit the context. It doesn't fit the historical context that we're even looking at if you're connecting Daniel chapter 2 and chapter 7 and now chapter 8 with these different nations these different kingdoms and nations that will arise at different times. So it just doesn't fit. It's too far-fetched, so to speak. But what we do know is that during this particular time period that's being talked about, and some things we'll talk more specifically about next week, is that this is a time period where the Lord's people are going to have a hard time worshiping Him in regards to being at the temple. There are some things that happen, and they even make some concessions along these lines, and great transgressions are committed. Remember, that's one of the things that He said is, because of your transgressions, this is going to take place. And so some of that happens. And we see that in some historical records. But what we eventually find is, no matter who tries to get in God's way of His will, they're always defeated. And that's part of what is said here. Is that 2,300 evenings and mornings is not an infinite number. Whatever it represents, and most likely it is a reference to one of the first two things we talked about, either the 3.5 years or the 6 years and 4 months that we talked about, because that fits the context of the time period. But whatever the case, it's not an infinite number, right? It stops at some point in time. And that's what we see in verse 14, is that then the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. So as we finish our time together tonight, before we get into the deep historical stuff next week, what does this mean for us? Because Daniel, later on in the chapter, we find out that Daniel he gets physically sick with what he hears in this particular vision. And it's because of the great atrocities that are going to be dealt out among the children of Israel, the people of God, so to speak. So perhaps we can identify with the fact that right now there seems to be a lot of chaos in the world in which we live. And perhaps you're like, I think my parents have expressed this to me, they're concerned for the future of our country and of our world for our grandchildren. I remember years ago when we were telling people that we were having children, there were some, more than one, said, why would you want to bring children into this world the way that it is today? And I remember thinking, well, if the world's ever going to change, it's going to require people that are willing to have children, who are willing to raise them with it by a different standard than the ways of the world. Whatever the case, there's a lot of concern in our world right now about what the future is going to look like, and it's so very uncertain. And as Christians, we know, and we've said it probably to other people, we know that God is in control. It's one thing to say it. It's another thing to fully comprehend it. And I don't know that we will, because quite often hindsight's 20/20, isn't it? No pun intended being 20/20. It may be 2030 before we're able to look back and see some of the things that happened in this year that helped to shape the future for better or for worse. Hindsight's always 20/20. And it's in the midst of this that we have to exhibit our faith in God, our trust that He really is in control, by the way that we carry ourselves, by the attitudes that we have towards the things that are happening, by how we deal with people that we disagree with or that we don't necessarily would get along with, we don't get along with very well. Passages like this remind us of the fact that God is aware not only of our current circumstances, but God knows what the future holds, for better or for worse for His people. He knows what the future holds. And we must rest with the assurance that God knows exactly what we're going to go through before we ever arrive there. In the 27th Psalm in verse 1, this is a psalm that seems to be David in being inspired to write this and just crying out to God in a positive way, saying, God, I trust you with everything that I am. In Psalm 27 and verse 1, he says, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? There's a lot of trepidation in this world today, right? It's not wrong to feel uncertain. But David says, the Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Not my political party, not my house, not my career, not my wife. The Lord is my stronghold. Of whom shall I be afraid? You know, Jesus later on, as he's speaking to his disciples, he says, look, don't fear those who have the ability to take your life, your physical life. You need to be more concerned about your spiritual life. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be concerned about our physical life. It's not to say that we shouldn't understand that this is a very serious time in which we live in regards to the pandemic, in regards to the economy, in regards to the future even of our country and the world. But it doesn't mean that we sit there and live in fear all the time. Fear paralyzes us, and we can't allow it to do that. And in this particular period of time that we're living, people need to see Christians as bold and courageous and trusting individuals because of the faith that we have in God. Now, what that looks like, it just means that, you know what? Whatever happens, we know that God's got this. He's got it under control. He knows what's going on. And no matter how out of control it seems to me to be, I still trust in Him. And whatever I have to face in the future, God already knows what that is. He already knows what obstacles are going to be there. And He sent His Son so that we can live with the assurance that no matter what happens, that the eternal kingdom will never, ever be destroyed. And that someday we're going to live in His presence forevermore. I hope that this has kind of helped you to understand a little bit better the first part of this. Like I said, we're really going to get into the historical record next week in Daniel chapter 8. I just didn't want to pack it all into one lesson. I wanted to make sure that we were able to spend a good amount of time examining and looking at this particular vision before we dive into the historical aspect. So I hope that you'll be back next week as we really dive into that and again, figure out more of just this amazing part of these visions of Daniel. God bless. Have a great evening, and Lord willing, we'll see you soon.